All right, welcome back everyone to my round 7 recap from Biel. I had a really interesting game today, and I actually finished a couple hours ago, but I had a bad headache after the game, so I took some rest, and now I'm a little bit more awake and ready to share what was a really interesting battle. So I was playing International Master Rohith Krishna from India, and coming into this game, I didn't really know what to expect because my opponent has played knight f3 and e4 and d4 in the past. So I was really just coming in with an open mind and ready for a fight. And he opted for pawn d4, and we went into a queen's gambit declined. And most people these days who I encounter take on d5 right away, but my opponent opted for bishop g5, which is definitely a playable line, leaving the tension in the center. I played c6. It was a solid move, creating the semi-Slav setup. And after e3, I played knight b d7, and then he takes on d5. So we're essentially getting a queen's gambit declined exchange variation, but from a slightly delayed move order. And after bishop to d3, I wanted to put the bishop on d6, but this wouldn't be as good. Now, bishop d6 was a setup I played in my third round game, but in that game I wasn't committed to knight b d7. And there's cases in these bishop d6 lines where the knight likes to maneuver to a6, c7, and e6. So I ended up going for a more traditional setup here with bishop to e7, very simply breaking the pin of the knight. And I can quickly turn on the database. We can see that this position has occurred over 3,000 times in master level play. And my opponent played the main line, queen to c2. And I played a move here which I discovered many years ago, and it's a move that just attempts to be very solid for black, is knight to h5. And this is still very much within the realm of opening theory. And the idea of this move is simply to force a trade of the dark squared bishops, given that the knight is controlling f4, so bishop f4 doesn't make any sense for white, and there's really no other place for this bishop to hide. So we do trade. He takes on e7, I take back with the queen, and he plays knight g e2. Now, I was remembering a small trap here that if white plays knight f3, pretty sure there's a strong move knight f4. This has been played in master level play, but it's a nice idea to exploit the pin on e-file and hit the bishop and the g2 pawn. And this, I think, would be very comfortable for black to play going into the middle game. But that didn't happen because he plays knight e2, breaking the pin and preventing any knight f4 ideas. So here I play knight to b6. And I'll admit that I wasn't in specific preparation, but I knew a general setup for black, basically to put the knight here, put the bishop here, and then depending which way white castles, I'm going to basically castle the same way as white. So if white castles kingside, I'll eventually castle kingside. If white castles queenside, I'll go for the queenside castling as well. And what happened is white castled queenside, and I go for bishop e6, h3, and castle queenside myself. So it's pretty rare that we get an opening where both players queenside castle, but it does happen. And in this case, we're basically done with the opening and approaching the middle game. And I kind of have to sneeze. This is probably a good time to run an ad. Wait, now I don't have to sneeze. I have been suffering from some allergies. The weather has been very good here, but yeah, I'm allergic to something. Maybe I'm allergic to both players castling queenside. What to do? Okay, no sneeze happening. What was I saying? So we both castle queenside. We're approaching the middle game. And from here, my opponent plays pawn g4. So very clear that white wants to grab space on the king side. I have nothing better than to retreat to f6. And then he plays pawn to f3, which is a flexible move. It solidifies g4, also creates ideas of later playing e4. And I played my next move relatively quickly, king to b8, which is a very flexible move, and almost always a king is just preferable on the b8 square, no longer aligned with the white queen. And then my opponent quickly responds with king b1, so doing the same idea. And then I play the move pawn to h5. So I'm trying to exert pressure on the king side and perhaps give white some questions of what to do with the g-pawn. And there are cases where I do want to take and then open the H file. I was also thinking maybe later of playing bishop to c8, unleashing queen to hit the e-pawn. So white does have to be a little bit careful here. And he ended up playing the move pawn to g5, which does look like the most testing move, questioning where I'm going to put my knight from f6. And I retreat to the e8 square, which at first looks really ugly, but I figured that the knight is actually going to be pretty happy on the d6 square, where it combines really nicely with this pawn structure. And for anyone that plays the Queen's Gambit Declined, this is a useful maneuver to keep in mind. Like whenever you can get a knight to d6, then it can control a lot of key central squares. And I believe we call this knight the Capablanca knight. Pretty sure Capablanca was known for doing this type of thing in various middle games. So here my opponent plays h4. I achieve my Capablanca knight, and then he plays pawn to e4. So things are very much heating up, and it looks like white is just grabbing space. Like the last several moves, white's been expanding with the pawns, but I'm coping with the squares that I have. And I decided to go for knight to c4, which just seems to put the most amount of pressure on white, not only having ideas of knight e3 with a fork, but also unleashing my queen to potentially come to b4. And there's ideas of queen b4 and knight a3, if white's not careful, achieving the pin and the fork. So this is a potential pork. So white does have to be very, very careful now, given all the scary arrows. And he played a safe move, queen c1, ensuring that I can't come in to e3. But I respond with pawn takes e4, and after f takes e4, I find a really nice square for my bishop on g4, pinning the knight to the rook. And even though white has 2 center pawns and I have 0 center pawns, I was feeling very good just given the placement of my pieces. My bishop is rock solid, defended by the h-pawn. My knight's supported. I have superfluous knights, which in this case are a pretty nice thing. And I also have the 2 half-open center files that I can use to exert pressure against white's center pawns. So I was feeling good, and going forward from here, my opponent played king a1, which I wasn't fully expecting, but I think it's a logical move, definitely the safest square on the board for the king. And in this position, I played a move which at first looks very risky, but I was very happy with it once I considered it, and also when I eventually played it, is a move pawn to c5. And it looks risky because I'm conceding these squares and allowing potential for the knight to come in. I'm also giving white time to try and exploit my knight, which is attacked by the bishop, and also could potentially be attacked by the queen. But the reason why I played c5 is it's a way to try and just break apart white's center, and I'm putting immediate pressure against the d4 pawn. And keep in mind, the knight's pinned, so I'm threatening to take on d4. And another goal was just to remove the pawn from controlling e5. So if white plays d5 here, I would very happily plot my knight on e5 square, where it's just a really nice post, and it's very hard for white to remove. And meanwhile, these pawns are pretty much fixed on the light squares, which does not combine well for white's light squared bishop. So after I played c5, my opponent took a relatively long think and ended up playing the move knight to b5. Now, when I initially played c5, I knew that knight b5 was an option, but I didn't look at it so closely until it actually came on the board. And it is a kind of scary looking move at first, because not only is white threatening to take the knight, given that there's another attacker, but white's also getting the knight in and basically threatening queen f4 check. And if I'm not careful, I could walk into some like windmill ideas with the queen and the knight. But thankfully, in this position, I have the move pawn to a6, which attacks the knight and creates a little bit more loft for my king. And now the ball is back in white's court, because if the knight moves, like if it moves back to c3, white's accomplished nothing, and I just win the pawn on d4. And meanwhile, if white plays queen f4 check, I simply move back to a8, and if he goes in for the check, I play king a7, and I think the knight would have gone in a little bit too deep here. Yeah, it looks really messy, like a lot's going on, but I'm pretty sure black is in very good shape in this position. So rather than going for that line, my opponent took on c4 here, and after I take back, he then plays queen f4, I play king 8, and then he retreats to c3. So this is a good sign that my opponent didn't really make much use of the knight coming to b5, had to move back. And in this position, it looks like I'm very close to winning the d4 pawn, given the pressure that the bishop is still exerting. Also, I have two attackers against d4. But it's not super simple, given that after I take, he takes back with rook, and everything appears to be defended for white. But I chose to go into this line because there's a way to just make continual threats. And I play my next move, queen to b4, simply threatening mate in 1. But not only that, I'm aligning with the rook on d4. And very soon we're going to see the tactic for black. After he retreats with queen c1, I take on d4, he takes back, and then I take on b2. And I took some time to go into this, but I figured that this wins a clean pawn after he takes and I take the knight. And I'm up a pawn, and it seemed like a position which I have very good chances to win because we're pretty much in the endgame as well. But to my opponent's credit, he found some very resourceful counterplay, and he started with a move rook to b1 here, taking advantage of the newly half-open b-file for white, and now it's white who's threatening mate in 1 against my b-pawn. And when I saw this position from a distance, I thought that I would end up playing pawn to b5, but I couldn't gather myself to play it because it just looks so weakening to my king. And yeah, I was scared of ideas of queen a3 during the game. I have since checked with the engine, and apparently queen a3 can be met with king b7, and black is completely fine here. But even if I did play b5, it's not that simple for black, because white has knight d5, which I think would be likely to go into some endgame after the trade of queens, and it would take a ton of work for black to try and win. But rather than playing b5 and exposing my king, I decided on what looked like a safer move, rook to b8. And here my opponent goes for knight d5, essentially forcing the queen trade. Of course, I want to take the pawn, but it's gotta be way too risky. Like knight b6, king a7, queen f2 looks terrifying because now it's my king who is in trouble. And yeah, I just didn't want to mess with this. It's actually easy for black to blunder mate here, like queen f3, thinking I'm stopping the discoveries, walks into this move, double check, and then queen a7 mate. So going back, I eventually realized that I do have to trade queens. I take on b2, he takes back with king. And in this position, I played my next move relatively quickly, not even taking more than a minute, king a7. The reason why I played this so quickly is because I assumed that the knight is eventually going to give a check, and my king is just more useful on a square where it can't immediately be checked by the knight. But after this move, he played rook f1, and then there starts to be some annoying counterplay for white, given that my f-pawn is a target, and I played the natural move to defend it, but then he has this very annoying move, knight f4. And what I don't want to allow is for the position to simplify too much, and he's threatening to win the pawn on h5, he's also threatening to win my bishop, and I think what I originally wanted to play here was bishop c4, but I couldn't quite make it work. Like he has this move, and then my bishop and pawn are still attacked. So instead I chose to repeat the position. I move back to g4, he moves back to d5, and then I play the move rook e8. So this is one way to avoid the repetition and keep the game going. And the idea with this move is I'm trying to get a beneficial trade, where if he takes the pawn, I was calculating takes, and then bishop e6, after which I'm hitting the knight and hitting the pawn, and I thought there'd be like decent chances to play for a win from here. If he plays knight c7, I have bishop c4, eventually I'm going to take on h4, And generally in these situations, the bishop is more useful than the knight because it can both defend against white's passed pawn and also assist on the queen side. Like there's always ideas of eventual rook h2 and then perhaps winning a2. Unfortunately, we didn't go into any of this because rather than taking on f7, my opponent played just a very solid move, rook f4. And this move simply defends the pawn and puts the question, what is black doing next? And I took a long time here trying to figure out how I can potentially play for a win, but I couldn't come up with anything so clear. And I ended up playing the move bishop to e6. I do want to note my alternative was king b8. The reason why I didn't go for this is because now after takes, there's this move knight f4. And this was possible in the other line too if my king were still on a7, but I didn't want to risk potentially losing this position. Even though I'm up a pawn here, it looked a little bit risky given that I'm not easily winning h4, and white has the idea of knight g6 and then winning g7 and defending h4. I think maybe black can still try and play for a win, but it just didn't seem so clear. And I played bishop e6 given that it's a much safer option. But after he plays knight c7, the position liquidates very quickly. I play rook e7, he takes, I take, he takes on f7, I take on e4, he takes on g7, I take on h4, and yeah, the more pawns that come off the board, the closer we get to a draw. Eventually we do trade the pawns on the king side, and I was considering offering a draw right away, but I figured I'd at least try a little bit. There's no risk for black, but we're going to see that I didn't really make any progress. My one hope was to, at some point, try and trade rooks. For example, after I played rook d6, if white takes, then I'm pretty sure this is a winning king pawn ending because it's some weird, like, distant opposition. Can check with the table base. Oh, no, king c2 is drawn. Ah, because if here, then king d2, and I can't actually make progress without allowing white to get the opposition. So yeah, even my one hope of trading rooks still leads to a drawn ending. But yeah, from my opponent's perspective, he is just safer keeping the rook on the board. And yeah, we played a handful of more moves, and I made no progress. And eventually, yeah, my opponent started checking me. I ran to a6, but after king b3, I didn't want to torture my opponent or torture myself anymore. And we agreed to a draw after I played rook to g3 check. So overall, I think it was a pretty solid game on my part. I don't think I was ever worse in this game. And I do want to show the overall engine analysis of this game. Let's just switch tabs here. We can see that actually from both of us, it was incredibly clean. My opponent did make 2 inaccuracies, but according to Lichess Stockfish, I made no inaccuracies, no mistakes, no blunders. Maybe there were some points where I could have put a bit more pressure, but I mean, given that I played 97% accuracy in this game, I really don't have too many complaints. And yeah, kudos to my opponent for defending what seemed to be a tricky position. So, yeah, it was a tiring game. It took over 4 hours, and even though it's one game a day, these games are draining, and I think it requires a lot of just mental and physical stamina to get through the tournament without getting too fatigued. So I do appreciate those watching until the end of the recap. If you have questions or comments, leave them below, or if you just want to wish me luck in the next round, leave your good luck wishes below. And do stay tuned for the final 3 rounds. I'm currently 4 out of 7. So on a +1 score, I'll probably be playing a higher rated opponent next round as well. So stay tuned, and I'll see you guys in the next one.